Hello and welcome to the Warhannam channel. My name is Ian and I think it's time I got the obligatory Waaagh out of the way. Waaagh! Okay, in this video I'm going to continue playing with contrast paints. I'm really enjoying testing things out and finding a method that works for me. If you watched my last video on using contrast over a complementary base, you'll know I've been exploring switching up the standard black to white zenithal method. This is also going to be a chance to try out some new paints I picked up. This definitely isn't a case of me being a teacher, but simply experimenting and probably making heaps of bad choices and mistakes along the way, so do feel free to point those out and share your wisdom with me. But it's all a learning journey, right? I'll be painting this model in two parts. Firstly, a simple contrast paint, apart from the metals, to get a finished model done quickly. We're going to call that the Nob Job. Then I'm going to go back and make some additions like highlights and weathering to turn our Ork Mob Job into an Ork... Hang on, and I can't believe I'm going to say this. Our Ork Mob Job into an Ork Nob Job. So, on with our Mob Job. Okay, and here's our Beast Snagga Boy. I started by giving the model a reddish zenithal, starting with Army Painter Chaotic Red, then Wraithbone from 45 degrees and from above. I decided against white this time, as I found the white spray can gives a bit of a powdery finish, and I also wanted to try a bit more of a gritty and less bright look. So it's less of a zenithal really and more of a semithal. I next go over this with a diluted Carroburg Crimson shade to reinforce the details and tie together the two colour prime. It's worth me pointing out that the Rattlecan top spray does leave a bit of a speckled finish, which if you just want a quick whole army approach isn't such a big issue, but on an individual model it's definitely noticeable, so I think I'll look into how I can mitigate this a bit more in the future. Maybe I can use contrast to get some manual shading. Any suggestions are welcome, and I'm sure if enough people like and subscribe and comment, my wife will let me buy an airbrush. Okay, and straight onto the flesh. I picked up Mantis Warrior Green to try. I apply this all over the skin areas, being careful not to splash it onto any other details. I found it really useful to have a spare damp brush next to me to mop up any bits that do get messy before the paint dries. For me, no green skin is complete without ruddy knuckles and ears, so I'll apply a 6:1 contrast medium to blood red mix over these areas carefully. I then apply a small amount of Athematic Blue under the eyes and Blood Angel's Red on the eyes themselves. And to make those luscious lips stand out a bit, I went for a 1:1 mix of contrast medium and orc flesh. I picked up a pot of Skeleton Horde to try on the teeth, nails and bone. It covers well on the brighter areas, but maybe next time I'd apply a bit of Wraithbone beforehand to the darker areas first. I apply Snakebite Leather to, you guessed it, this Snakebite's Leather, and I'm super impressed with this one. I think it will become a real staple for me. It's really rich and has great coverage. For the skin portion of the hide, I'm going to apply some Guilliman flesh. Now Beast Snaggas come with a variety of skins and furs. This one is wearing a fur pelt, so I'm going to have a go at a simple striped pattern you might find on a wolf. I start with Skeleton Horde all over, followed by some Gore Grunter fur stripes, and then inside of those, Black Templar. I didn't wait for each coat to dry completely, as I'd hoped it might allow for some natural blending. And I'm actually quite keen to try this on something a bit less dead. I applied Basilicanum Grey to the trousers, and I have to say this was the colour I was probably most disappointed in. The coverage just didn't seem quite as good as some of the others in the darker areas. So some of that reddish undercoat definitely shows through. So I actually had to go back and do a second coat. I went with Iandan Yellow for some of the armour and plates, as I really liked using it last time I tried it, and I'm definitely keen to see what I can do with it when I try and weather it later on. I used Blood Angel's Red as a bit of a spot colour, so I've applied it to the loincloth, and I'm also going to put it on some of the gun casing. I went for Rattling Grime on the stitches and the string. Admittedly, I found it was a bit dark, but that does mean I don't have to be as concerned with getting it on the grey, as it won't stand out. I'll definitely come back to that later and hit it with a highlight. I wanted to keep the metals nice and simple at this stage, so I painted the areas I wanted silver with lead belcher. I then painted some areas I wanted to be brass with brass scorpion. I applied a coat of Agrax Earthshade to both metals. And there we are, a straightforward, mostly contrast Beast Snagga that would be easy to paint at a decent speed and give a finish that would look pretty decent in a big horde. I did a simple cork base painted with Zandri dust, then covered with skeleton horde before dry brushing it Ushabti bone, and then the obligatory black rim. Okay, so now we're going to attempt to turn this mob job into a Nob Job. I'm going to restrict myself to one highlight per colour and then add a bit of weathering, because although I'm looking to level up the paint job, I also don't want to spend ages on it, so it could easily be replicated across an army at a decent pace. I start by highlighting the flesh Nurgling Green, including over the lips and those ruddied areas we applied earlier. I then just add a bit of interest to the skin with some dappled liver spots. I applied a few dots of a mix of Mantis Warrior and Snakebite Leather in selected areas. I brighten up the bone, teeth and nails with a highlight of Pallid witch flesh. Going back over the leather areas, I used Cadian Flesh Tone as an edge highlight, as well as using it to apply some scratches. No orc worth his teeth has pristine gear after all. I next highlight those yellow areas of armour with Dawn Yellow. Quite poorly it seems, so at least I found some areas to hide with some weathering later on. Totally deliberate. I highlight the red areas such as the fetching loincloth and gun sight with Wild Rider Red. For the grey trousers, I highlight with Dawnstone and try and make them look a little bit scuffed. For the stitching and bits of string, I highlight these with Ulthuan Grey, which really helps them stand out. For the eyes, I highlight the bottom with Troll Slayer Orange. Then I add a small white dot, although this came out a little bit bigger than I'd hoped, but there's only so much you can do leaning over a camera. Turning my attention to that fine fur throw, I use Pallid witch flesh to highlight the tips of the fur strands, but I'm sure a dry brush could work here too if you wanted to speed it up. The fleshy areas of the pelt were then just given a quick highlight of Cadian flesh tone. Right, and now onto some fun stuff. Using a torn piece of sponge, I dip it in Rhinox hide and dab most of it off. I then dab it on some of the edges of the painted armour in selected areas. It's often said less is more, but sometimes more is more too. So it's really just a case of mucking around and seeing what looks right to you. Under those Rhinox scratches and dents, I go back in with the highlight colours I used earlier to give that depth effect. So Dawn Yellow on the yellow sections and Wild Rider Red on the red. You can definitely be a bit scattergun here, and you really don't need to worry about hitting every part. Next up, it's time to highlight the metals, and as I'm going for somewhat being speedy, I do both metal colours with Stormhost Silver. It's also a good opportunity to add some scratches at this step too. At this point I realise I completely forgot the wrap on the chopper and the bullet belt, so I quickly hit it with some Karak stone. I'm not sure if it was the best colour choice, but it was right there next to me on the desk, so I just went with it. Finally, I'm going to add some weathering to the metals. I'm going to start off with Nihilakh Oxide on those brass areas, really aiming for the recesses and around any rivets. Then next, on the silver metals and also on the painted metals, such as the shoulder pads, I'm going to use watered down Scrag Brown to fill in recesses and around rivets. I really like the kind of rusty effect this gives. And ta-da! Or should that be ta-dwa? I also applied a bit of that Scrag Brown around the rocks on the base, and I dabbed it in a few areas too, before applying a tuft. I'm fairly happy with the result to effort ratio, and really the main thing I think I'd like to tweak is that undercoat. But even with that, I certainly wouldn't be embarrassed pushing an army painted to this level around the table. So that Contrast Plus level feels pretty achievable on a big scale, and was also quite a lot of fun to do. Thanks so much for joining me as I played around with paints. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe even found something useful you can take away and try. Please do like, subscribe and all the other fun YouTubey stuff, and I'll see you next time. Bye!